This is Virtuel. We're an online healthcare clinic. We do online interviews, pass them on to a nurse practitioner, and get you a treatment plan and prescription in like 30 minutes. Very cool service. If you're interested in working here, more about the service or anything, Virtuel, come talk to me. SDG sponsors our pizza and beer, and the reason why we're eating so good and drinking so good this year. Troy and Brooke are there in the back. Do you guys want to give a little bit about your note?
Yeah, I can just say we're just. Yeah, we're a local IT consultant firm, hire full-time salaried employees in the open source space and Microsoft space. If you're interested in talking to us too, or as well.
Very good. And on that note, hiring if we're looking for work, like an excellent company to work for. Is anybody else looking for work or looking to hire, looking for volunteers? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm JT. I work for Workfront. We're based out of Lehigh, Utah. We've sponsored NGConf for the last 2 years. Okay. We have a satellite office here in the everything slowly over to Angular. You're enterprise, so we don't get to jump to Angular 2 quite yet. So if you're comfortable on 1.2 and 1.3, I'd love to talk to you.
So from front end stuff.
Front end, imagine a to-do list from steroids for large companies. That's what our product is.
Cool. Very cool. What was the name of your company?
Workfront. We used to be at Task.
What's your name?
JT. JT.
Very cool.
To sponsor something.
My name's Brian, and we're kicking off a project. Back end will be Spring Boot and Gorm, which I think is kind of an interesting combo. Most people use Grails these days, but we're trying to go out to a little bit new direction there. And then in the front end, we're going to use Angular. Probably go with 1.4, try to stay as current as we can to try to get ready for the big upgraded 2. So if you're interested in possibly working a little bit more on the bleeding edge, feel free to come and see me.
Well, are we looking for a remote group to work on the project or anything?
Yeah, so is Jim here? No? You didn't make it? Okay.
I think he was on the wait list. I hit him up super last minute. For those of you who made on the wait list, thank you for coming. We try to accommodate as many, but go ahead.
Jim and Dale were looking to upgrade our Prizatron, the thing we use to hand out our prizes, to Angular 2, and looking for people to kind of make it a community effort. So I'm going to try and pitch in where I can. I've got a lot of stuff going on, but if you're looking to get in on that, find at Jim the Dev, at Dale Lotz, I think, right? Or myself at WBucksoft on Twitter, and we'll find the place for us, like the GitHub account to file issues or something.
Yeah,
we'll figure it out.
Definitely pitch in too, and feel free to use the Meetup page to communicate for that stuff.
He commented about it in our tonight's Meetup page, so if you're looking for it, that's one place you can find it.
Yeah, definitely throw a comment there. Jim the Dev. Interesting. Cool. On that note, do we have any lightning talks anybody want to give?
Got one.
Go over here.
Yeah.
What kind of dongle do you need?
I don't know.
Yeah.
HGA will work.
BJ?
Yeah, I think I got HGA too.
Yeah,
HDMI's always got there.
Yeah, HDMI, that's my best.
Let's switch the thing.
That's DisplayPort, which we may also have. I've never actually seen a DisplayPort input. We have output for the.
Oh, PGA will work.
Is that what's plugged into me though?
Yeah, I bought that.
Oh wait. Let's try to plug this into a Windows PC.
Yeah.
Oh, that'll work.
Yeah, just right into the lightning
I
port.
got a
Right?
Dell that.
I'm not a hardware guy.
Oh yeah, so yeah, custom build.
Okay, cool. So I was goofing around. I'm working on an app where I always am about maybe a quarter of the way done because I think it's something else cool I want to try. But I pulled out a bunch of code out of that and put it in here because what I'll show you is Firebase and Angular Fire, and this came together in like 20 minutes for me. And this is just a single HTML file, so it's already uploaded to the Angular Meetup, so you can download it and take a look at it or run it. And I'll just go through this real quick. So I've got a style up here, and all that does is it gives me a spot, so I can draw a little circle on my page. So then we've got an Angular app, so we've got a controller here. And in the controller, you can see I've just got a really pretty simple ng repeat. Where did that go? Yeah, ng repeat. And that's going to do something pretty cool. We'll look at that in a second. And then, fortunately, everything I need is on a CDN, so I don't have to have a server running. So what I'm downloading is Lodash. If anybody, or Lodash is like underscore, and if you haven't used underscore in your apps, you really got to. It helps you write really concise JavaScript. And then jQuery, because I'm going to do some dumb stuff here. Angular, and then the last two are the Firebase and the Angular Fire. So what Firebase is a online object-oriented database, and you can sign up for that. And if you have a small usage, so it's a pretty simple, low bandwidth usage, it's free, and they have commercial licenses too. But for development purposes, it's really pretty cool. If you're doing something where you've got a back end, and what you're doing is sending JSON objects to the back end, and you're not doing any joins or anything that you need like a SQL server or anything for. If you're just doing object database development, Firebase is a good tool to wire up early on, and then you can move to your MongoDB or whatever, if you build your infrastructure. But this one's, online, it's free, it's available. And then Angular Fire is the wiring up between the Firebase and your Angular app. And that's pretty much it for the JavaScript stuff. And so then I've got the Angular app here. I don't have a pointer, do we? Like a laser thing. And then so the next thing I've got is a service. So I'm using a color service to give me a set of colors. And this is where I'm using that underscore or the Lodash thing here. And basically what this is, I won't go into details here, but in a pretty concise statement, what I'm doing is generating a list of 200 random colors, random HTML colors. So I've got a set of hex characters here. The range function generates a list that's going to be, in this case, 200 elements long. It's a list of 200 numbers. And all I really want is a list that has 200 things in it. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to run that through the map function. And what map says is for each one of those things, execute some function, and I'll collect the results and put them in an array. So I'm going to end up with 200 somethings that are generated by repeated iterations of this function. And what that's going to do is the pound is, the HTML color thing. And then we're going to pull 6 random characters out of this string here. And that produces a list of 6 individual characters. So then we join them together to get a string. So you get a string of 6 characters. We prefix the pound sign, and there you go. You've got an HTML color number. And so then we've got basically 200 of those. And then I expose that list here as a function. So if I want a function for the first color, the second color, the third color, I pass in a value here, and it will go in and look in that array, of course, and return the value. And this is, anybody familiar with the revealing module pattern? Yeah. Okay, so that's what I'm doing here. If you look at this service, if you instantiate the service and look at the properties of the service, you'll only see the color function is exposed. Everything else, all this other implementation is hidden. You can't get to it. It's enclosed inside that function. Okay, so that's the color service, and then I got one more. Okay, so this is the fun one. So I'm creating a service that will let me create spots. Okay, and so the details here. So first thing I need to do is open up a Firebase connection. So that's done through this object, and this value here is basically your app key that you get when you register for Firebase. It'll give you this URL, and that's the one that you use for your app. Somebody else will have a different one. And then on the end here, this is basically the collection, the object collection that you're working with. So you can have more than one object collection. You have a separate invocation of a Firebase connection for each one of those objects. And then this here, this is that Angular Fire service that will take and wrap that Firebase object in an Angular object. And then the last things that I'm doing is I've got a function here that will create a new spot for me, and it just creates a JavaScript object, right? So it creates an object that has an X and a Y and a color property, and it uses that color service to get the color. So if I have, see my spots here, is going to be a list of objects. It's Firebase array. So I'm going to have a list of objects. And so if I add a new item to the end of the list, then I can use this color function to get the appropriate color for that object. And then we just have add, remove, and clear, and those just delegate to the Firebase objects to do that operation. So that Angular Fire gives you an add, a remove function, and the clear function I just call remove repeatedly until list is empty. Right? So if we see, and that's it. That's the whole entire app. There's almost no code. Oh, then I've got a controller which wires up the click events. The one thing I want to show here is that I had to do something kind of tricky here because the spot ends up on the background on the div. And so if you click on the div and you happen to click on a spot, you end up actually giving a jQuery event. The click happens on both of those, the spot and the underlying div. And so I don't want it to click the underlying div. So I call this stop propagation, right? So that will take care of that. And that's it, okay? And we'll see how that works here. I can fire that up in Chrome. So there's really this, it's almost all declarative code. There's almost no actual code there. Did I click that right? There we go. So this is the app, and if I click here, so what's happening here, of course, is that there's an ng click event that's wired up to this div, and when I click it, we call a method. We call this method here on click, and all that does is it calls the spot service to add a new spot at the XY location that we clicked on. And the spot service adds the new spot to that Firebase array by calling add in Firebase. That adds it to the list, and then Angular binds that list again. And we just use little CSS to put it in the right spot, and that's that. And if I click on the spot, it goes away because I click on that spot, and then it removes it because there's an ng click event for each one of those spots. Okay, and then I can clear the entire list. Oh, if I click. Hello, it used to work. Okay.
It wouldn't be a
So
demo.
I'll write a Jira ticket and we'll take care of it.
That's fine.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a demo if it worked.
The other fun thing that you get out of the box with Firebase is that is since I'm wired up to the same backend database on both browsers, so one's Firefox and one's Chrome, we just get both instances of this application are reading in essentially real time. They're being updated by the back end. And I didn't have to write any code to do that. Yeah, so on the back end, Firebase, well, so there's a lot of things. Yeah, you could write a game. It's not, you don't get guaranteed, throughput, right? So you get all these latency issues. I don't know what they happen with might be, right? For a real-time game, you want real snappy, really low latency. So you can see here, it takes a second for things to show up. And then, of course, because all of this data is actually in the database on the back end, if you're not careful, you'll fill up your database and they'll start charging you. So
Will they do that? Will they just go to paid service?
well, they throttle it. So I think if you get a certain number of transactions or something a month, right? So what I'm working on is an app similar to this where I'm using Leaflet, and there's an Angular wrapper for Leaflet to generate a map, and then I click spots on the map and do stuff with it. And so this was basically I just extracted some of that and put it in this little demo app. So that's it. There's a code up there, so you can take a look at the code if you want.
One of the things that I just learned about Firebase is you can also deploy your app to Firebase. So you can upload your HTML files and everything to their server, and then they're hosting it. I didn't know that.
Oh, okay.
So if you look at their command line interface, they've got a deploy option.
And like,
So it's, if you think about it, kind of like Heroku, where you kind of do a get push to Heroku, and your stuff's there and hosted on Heroku. It's kind of the way Firebase works, and it's
they charge you for that?
no. I mean,
For small usage, probably, right?
I mean, I don't. I'm sure we're in the same camp. I don't pay for anything.
Yeah,
So.
exactly.
I don't know. But anyway, yeah, it's pretty cool. All right.
That guy? Anybody hear that guy? So, go ahead and start here. My name is John Urberg. I'm an application architect at LifeTouch. Today I want to talk about modern RPG. When I started out of school in the early 90s, I worked on an IBM AS400, which is mid-range and wrote a lot of RPG, and has changed a lot since then. I don't know if anybody here has ever worked on RPG in the past, or on a mainframe. So today I'd like to talk about all the new and exciting things in RPG, as well as show you how to write some Angular screens using RPG, because it's clearly a much better language than JavaScript. So actually, this is AngularJS best practices.
That's awesome.
I am John Urberg, working at LifeTouch. We've been using AngularJS now probably for about over a year. Personally, I've been working on it. First few projects we worked on were a couple of small applications. We built an image editor that used the canvas HTML and used AngularJS to organize the code. Built a little ad builder that would take SVG files and allow you to choose on image areas to upload your images to them and change text. And currently working on a fairly large project where we're converting our main e-commerce mobile site, our main e-commerce site, which only works on a desktop, to work on a mobile site, and that's going to be a single-page AngularJS application. So no presentation is, you can't have a presentation without a Wikipedia quote. So best practice, a method or technique that is consistently shown results superior to those achieved with other means. Or another way to put it is it's superstitions that programmers have.
That's awesome.
All right, so before I go into it, how many of you here have not done much work with Angular? Okay, so this talk isn't really an introduction to Angular, but I am going to give just a quick overview for those of you who are not know Angular that well. I found this picture from Dan Whalen, who's a blogger on the .NET side of things, doing a lot of Angular stuff. And this is kind of an overview of what the different pieces of Angular look like. So everything in Angular is stored in a module. And inside that module, there's configuration. And then any real non-trivial app is going to have routes in it. So as you move from view to view, routes change, but your page still stays loaded. You don't go back to the server. And each route would consist of a view, which is an HTML template for that section of the screen. And the view could possibly have directives in it. And those directives are reusable HTML components. And then every view also has a controller with it. And there's this scope, magic scope object between there that does the communication between your HTML and your controller. And then he calls this factory, Angular calls them providers, I like to call them services. They come from kind of a Java view of the world. And so this comes from the Angular tutorial. So here's a very simple example of a basic Angular app. So on the JavaScript side of things, you have to create a module. And the way you create a module is on the Angular object, you call it the module function, passing in the name of your module. And then you pass in a list of other modules that your application is going to use. And then once you have a pointer to that module, you can start adding things to it. So here I'm going to add a controller for a list of phones. So this is like a little mobile phone listing app. We pass in a pointer to scope, and that's our little magic communication channel. And on there I have a list of different phones. And then your HTML template is the other side of things. So you define the application at what point in your HTML this application covers. In this case, it's the whole HTML page. Bring in my source, and then I say for this section of the HTML, which is the whole body, our phone list controller is going to cover that. And then here's a case where I have an ng repeat directive, which is going to go then and for each phone create a new list element. And then here we're doing some interpolation with the two little curly braces to bring those values in. And this is the picture of what it looks like then when it's up and running. Your application level, you're going to have a root scope. And then each controller then is going to get its own scope that inherits from the scope that it's in. In this case, my controller is within the root scope, so it inherits from that. And then each directive here, this ng repeat directive, is going to create its own scope there. And so the phone object is inside of this scope, which inherits from this, so then phones is available there, so on. So that's the 5-minute Angular description. So what I've got to present today is a little grab bag of best practices. Over the years, I've been getting to know Angular better. I've been researching the web to try to find the best way to use it. Most of these are not mine. I've just found them as they come along, although a few here and there are ones that I've come up with too. And I kind of organize them into different sections. So to start out with, I'd like to talk about code organization. So I'm going to be using this Angular tutorial quite a bit because there's a lot of bad practices that they use. First one here, you can see how they organize their files. They have a separate file for each type of thing, and so all your controllers are in the controllers files. All the directives are in that file. As you can imagine, if you're working on a large project, you got 3 different people who both need to make changes. All need to make changes to controllers. You're going to have a little clash there. So first thing we should do is always define a single component per file. So to take our example, we can break them down into 2 files, one for the application, a separate one for the phone list, right? And I always try to name it to match that specific element. So my phone list controller, the name of the file matches it, so it's really easy to find. And so then usually there's only one person working on at least a single element at a time, so you're not going to have as many clashes when you're changing your code. Then when we get to the directory structure, a couple different ways that are good to do this. If you have an app that's not as large, kind of a medium or small sized app, I like to break them down by type. So I'll have an app directory inside of there, a directory for each different type of thing. And this kind of models if you worked in Rails or Rails type of applications, you'll have the same sort of thing. And then I'll also then put any third-party stuff in a separate live folder there so that I can isolate code quality tools just against that directory and not bring in the third-party stuff. Now, if you've got a really large application, another way you could do it is to break it up by module. When we talk about modules, we'll get into a little more because as the application gets larger and you have different features, you might want to then have separate Angular modules, and so put the code in directories based on those modules. And you could take it even farther for a really big application. You could have a directory for invoices module in there. You could have a directory for controllers and directives and whatnot.
So why not just do that for small apps? Like, what's the advantage of?
Well, you certainly could do this for small apps. That both ways work. It just depends on your personal preferences. But the idea is to make it easy for you to find what you're looking for in that source tree. Okay, does everybody know what an API is?
Looks if you do.
All right. So at the minimum, instead of just dumping everything in a file and have it all in the global, wrap it in an API, and it's an immediately invoked function expression. So what this does is everything that's happening here is happening in that scope of that function, so everything inside of there is private to that function. And then it's immediately executed, so then it's, as the source code loads, it executes it, and then only the things that you return. So in this case, the app, I passed in a pointer to this, which would be the window, and only the app is put on the global. Anything else in there would be private to that specific file. And here then, when I want to bring in the app, I actually intentionally put it in there. It's coming in as a parameter, and it's used as a parameter inside the code. And then obviously, you want to be using usestrict too as you in strict mode as you're going forward.
So I have a question about this. Another way to write this is to not use your global app at all.
Yep.
But to do Angular module phone-cat, and then when you in your controller, you can do Angular module phone-cat app controller.
Yeah, you're skipping ahead. I'm actually going to point that out.
Because what I'm trying to understand is like, what's the? I see this a lot, and I understand, I guess, kind of the argument about not having it into the global space, but then why do this versus the other?
Yeah, so I personally prefer, it depends on what you're doing. So the next thing to point out is, if possible, use a module library. So I'm not talking about Angular modules, I'm talking about AMD or CommonJS or ES6. So these are things that are built in to break up your things into modules. Right, so an example here, if I'm using AMD, right, I define a module for my app that returns it, and now it's sitting within the module, so it's not global anymore. So that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is to actually call the Angular module function. But either way, the idea is to keep that app object off of your module object off of the global space.
Okay, so the purpose is don't make it global.
Exactly.
However you do that.
Exactly.
I have a question about controller naming. With the CTRL, I noticed that it was in the declared name and the file name too.
Yep.
One conversation that we had at Virtual initially when we got into Angular is we were naming controllers, the file names fully fleshed out, and then with the CTRL abbreviation within the file, and then went back and refactored all that, and then put the fully fleshed out to match the file name. What have you guys found in your experiences? Do you do the short version in both, or do you do one or the other?
We use the short version of both, but I think whether you use the short version or long version, it's it's a team standard, just make sure they match. All right, so here's an example using ECMAScript 6, and we'll talk about that a little more as we go along. And there's actually a module system built into the language now. And so we could also do this fashion here. But the idea is, as your system gets larger, use the module system to help organize your code better and define what the dependencies are between files. Okay, named functions. So all the examples that we saw, we were just passing in anonymous callback functions to define a controller. It's a lot better to do it this way. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is it decreases the amount of nesting that you have in your code. And secondly, it's putting a name on there, so when you have errors and want to look at the stack trace in your browser, if you don't have that name on there, it's just going to be an anonymous function. You don't know where it came from. So having that name on there helps you debug it.
Just laughing because there's an anonymous function in
That's true.
Yeah, sorry.
Fun fact, CoffeeScript can't do that. We learned that at Virtual, is that CoffeeScript, you can assign variables that with a name to a function, but you can't name a function in CoffeeScript.
Oh, really?
I went and researched for days trying to figure that out. As soon as I learned that, this is how you see all those @anonymous in your stack traces, and it drives you nuts, right? So I wanted to figure out how we could do that in CoffeeScript, and you straight up can't.
So what did you do? You just drop CoffeeScript or
do it.
do with it? Oh, okay.
Just deal with it, yeah.
CoffeeScript's on the way out.
Is it?
Yeah, script 6 is replacing most of it.
Yeah.
It makes, that is painful, and then debugging back and forth between JavaScript and CoffeeScript is just not fun.
Okay, so let's talk about modules. So Angular calls,
Are you going to talk about the inject at all?
yes, we'll get to that too.
We're
Just
gonna
kind of
skip
go
over this
step,
guy.
Yeah, I know, right?
we'll go step by step through kind of different areas. So.
Guys always skip that.
So Angular calls this the container for different parts. This is different from what we think of modular. This is a kind of container of different things. And so, again, here's an example of the phone cap app. In this case, I'm passing in the router module. And so that's going to then dump everything that's in the route module into this module along with the stuff you define. And then that module thing that you get back, that I'm calling the app, has functions on it then to add things into your module. So I can add in a controller, I can add in a service. And so one thing to keep in mind as you're doing this, we normally would think with other languages, modules separate things out from each other, but everything is global. So if I have a grid module that's got, grid service in it, and I try to put a grid service in my app, they're going to collide because they're the same name. So module getter. So instead of passing around your app object, you can, and again, it's a little confusing because if you call module passing it a string and an array, it's going to create one. If you leave out the array, it's just going to go and look up the existing one. So you can do this then, and then you don't have to have some global app object that you pass around. So these are the Google recommendations, and I think they're really good for how you should design your modules. Create a module for each feature. So kind of earlier, we're looking code organization. Let's say you have invoices feature and a customers feature and accounts feature. Create a module for each of those to group that code together. Another example would be to create a module for each usable component. So you create the next greatest grid, create a module for that so that you can take that and reuse it in other applications. And then there's an application module, which would use the different modules and contain initialization code. And oftentimes in a smaller app, I'll just have one module just for everything in the app because I don't need to break it apart. Don't do this. Here's right out of the Angular app. So the first Angular app I worked on actually had been started already, and the developer was brand new to it, and he learned working off of this, and sure enough, I came to the code base, and there was a module for the controllers, a module for the directives, right?
Guilty.
But it's, this is, you go through the tutorial, and this is what you think is best practice, what you're supposed to do based on the tutorial. And so I would suggest let's avoid that.
You just put them all in one app module? Sorry.
Yeah, usually, unless I have, if the app gets big enough and I have different things that I want to break them out into, then at that point I'll start breaking them out based on feature.
Yeah.
Right. But on apps that are kind of small or medium sized, I'll just have a one level app because I don't have any real reason to break them out into other pieces. And there's not really any reason other than separating them to reuse them because everything's going to be on a global namespace anyway. So you're not really getting any extra advantages from doing that.
So in our apps, we have some services that talk to the database, right? And they're essentially, take the JSON object and send it to the database, the backend. And there's other services that have some business logic in them that really belong as they're sort of part of the component.
Yep.
But we've been taking all of the services and putting them as sort of a monolithic unit, as a module. what do you see for that? Do you do that? I mean, you still separate out your services based on how you know what they belong to, or do you group them all?
Well, like I said, on a larger app, I would break them down by feature, but that would be, you know, these are the services. Let's say services for invoices, the controller for invoices. You know, you think about it when you're doing an OO design, how you might break up your dependencies into different, you know, packages, and those would be the things that you have modules for. Okay. But a lot of this is, you know, gets down to how you're designing your app and what's the best way to break things up into different pieces.
So kind of related to this, how do you deal with your dependencies? So I think the reason why I have, you know, a ton of different modules is because, like, if I have two modules that depend on, you know, some third-party thing, whatever, widget, rather than declaring that as a dependency on the app, I declare that as dependency on those two modules and not the app, because that's where it is, right? And I can do some analysis on what the dependency graph is. That way, do you do that, or what's?
Well, I think that's the right way to approach it, is to take a look at it just from a high level of the objects and components you have in your application, group them together, and understand the dependency graph between them.
Yeah.
And separate it out so you don't have a cyclical dependencies.
Right.
And then set your modules based on that. Okay. But when it gets down to it, though, when everything gets dumped into Angular, your application module is just a big giant
registry
space. Yeah.
Yeah, the registries.
Yep. Yeah. So the value in putting things as modules is when you want to be able to pull things out and reuse them in different apps. So. Cool. Okay. The injector, right? This is the magic thing that creates your components, resolves the dependencies between them, provides components to other things as requested. So global libraries, you're using underscore all over the place, and you want to write tests, and you want to just mock out your calls to underscore. You can underscore as a simple example. Maybe you have a larger library, maybe even jQuery. What you can do is you can actually wrap it as a factory and access it that way, so that when you're writing tests, you can then just mock out underscore. And when you're running your code, then just verify that it's calling the correct underscore methods. Again, this is a really simple example. You probably don't care for underscore, but something, let's say, you know, you're using jQuery and you're using a lot of plugins, you want to make sure your code is calling the plugins correctly. You can mock out jQuery and use that in your tests. So Angular, when it first started out, would go and read your function declaration, actually get the source for it, parse out the names of the parameters, and take those parameter names and go look them up to find the matching services for it, and then pass those in when it constructed it. Problem was, when you minified your code, minification would go turn scope into A, and it didn't work anymore. So they've got a couple of different ways that they've got to work on for this. The first one is to the let's say your controller or your service or whatever, you can add in a magic inject variable to it, passing an array of what the different parameters are, and so it's going to go one by one, look up this and pass it in the first parameter, and so on. A second option is when you declare a service or controller, you can pass in an array, which for the first variables are going to be the names of the parameters that you passed in the services. And then the last one is the actual thing, whether it's the controller or the service. Generally, I've seen this used the most, and we've been using it, but either way works. But I would suggest if you have any non-trivial application, you're going to want to merge it, compile it together and minify it. And so you're going to need to do that.
Fun fact, if you're using like ng annotate or something like that, so you don't put those things in there, you're actually missing out on a huge benefit of doing the dependency annotations. And that's that all the JetBrains products will actually allow you to click on the annotation and go right to the declaration. Yes.
So by using ng annotate, you lose that.
That's correct, because you don't have those annotations in your source code.
Okay, next subject, templates. So again, templates are just basically the HTML that has some Angular specific stuff in it. And here's the example from our tutorial. And it's just an HTML file. I got some scripts up there. My whole body is within this controller. I got to repeat. I got some, this is called interpolation with little curly braces there. So put the scripts at the end. That way the page can finish loading before the scripts do. And even better, take your scripts and combine them together, minify them. Of course, now that I've got that done and my page loads before my Angular even loads, right, those little curly braces are going to show up on my screen until Angular fires up. So instead, use ngbind. So I can replace this, instead of putting the little curly braces in there, put an ngbind annotation and put the value off the scope. And so it'll show up empty first until everything kicks in.
ngcloak kind of has similar functionality for if you're having to do like a string with a value. You don't want to select one instance I used here was like a pager number for like an on-call duty. So you don't want pager number is blank while that's being put in there. So you can cloak that until that data makes it across to your whatever statement you're making makes sense.
Yep, that's another option too. So there's a whole bunch of little directives that match HTML attributes. If they're available, they're probably preferable, especially source and href. If you're using these, and you're using the router service, the router will understand them. In ng class, you can put actually some expressions in there if you want to set the class based upon values on your scope. So if there's a ng option available, it's probably a good idea to use one of those. Okay. I like to call these things services because I come from the Java world where we use Spring and Grills and things like that, and we call them services. Angular calls them providers, and they call them a recipe for creating an object in the injector. So these guys are wired together using dependency injection. So if I have a service that has a dependency on something else, I will pass it into the constructor or to the function. They're all lazy instantiated, so they don't get created until you first access them. So if you have some sort of background service that you just want to run in the background, if you never have something that actually gets it during the run cycle, it's never going to be created. And they're all singletons, so the first time you get them, they're going to get created. After that, that's it. That's the instance you're working with for your app. And there's a whole bunch of them. In the end, they all do the same thing. They put something, some object associated with some name that you can get access to. A provider, a service, a factory, a value, and a constant. So what's the best way to use these? Start out with, we're going to use this. A common example I've seen out there, it's a little greeter service. This is a JavaScript, basic JavaScript prototype, similar to a class in other languages. The constructor takes the name and an optional salutation, and just got a little say hello function on it that combines them together. So constants. So these are things that are, the only thing that you can access during the config phase is a constant, right? So if I have something I want to pass into that phase, I would use this. Question, is this a constant? In my application, can I change the name once it's running? Yeah, right, because this points to an object. So the reason they call it constant is because you cannot override this thing with a delegate, right? If you really want to make this a constant, you have to do something like this. Values are for simple type of data. So if you have anything that doesn't need to have dependency injection, value would be a good option to use this. So here's an example of a string. Here's again, we're creating a JavaScript object, passing it in here. Here I'm creating my greeter service with a hard-coded name passed in. All these are different ways to use values. And so those things, those name services will be available then with that object in there. And that's the, again, it's a singleton. So once you create it, it's set for the life of the app. So you use service for singleton classes. So this is, you need to pass into this a constructor function. And when it first accesses it, it's going to call new on it. And it's going to go and find anything that thing uses and wire them in, pass them into the constructor function. And the new instance that is created then is what's going to be accessed from that on as the creator service. And this is what, you know, from coming from a Spring background, this is what I normally think of as a service. Factory is for more complex cases. So really, from a JavaScript standpoint, this is what you normally expect as what a service would be, right? It's the module pattern. I pass in a function that returns something. So when we first access greeter factory, it's going to call the function, take the return value. That's going to be your greeter factory from then on. So here's an example where I create basically a factory function that you can pass in a name and create new greeters. And then the provider. So the provider, when it first accesses it in your code during the run phase, it's going to call the $get. And whatever returns from that is what's going to be there. The reason you want to use something like this is you've got some reusable library. You want to make something available that you can configure and before using it. And so during the config phase, I could say, let's put a salutation method on there so I can configure the salutation. And during the config phase, I can set it there. And then when I first access it, then that's what's going to be used then going forward.
So if I remember right, services, constants, all of those are also providers?
Under the covers, this is, all those things have a provider for them that create them. It's this, the provider is the, going to be called the recipe. All right.
I wonder if you could, I was just curious if you could configure. It's probably not.
Not that I'm aware of, but you can do this. You can use decorators.
All right.
So anything that's other than constants, during the config phase, you can go and grab a hold of that, and it's going to pass into you then the, again, it's not created yet, so it's not the instance of the greeter service. It's actually whatever, in this case, greeter service was a constructor function. And I can go and grab that, I can add things to it and return it, or I could completely return something else. So for example, I could create a proxy around it. And so if you want to enhance some existing library, this would be the way to go about doing it.
Is there a way to add and remove decorators at runtime?
Once you hit runtime, you're done. So this can only be done during the config phase. Okay.
You could, of course, enable and disable them. If you have a decorator, you could put logic in there to disable it.
What I'm looking at is in my protractor tests, I want to sometimes be able to override the service of the method in a service for my test.
Oh,
Yeah,
we'll
you do
actually
it
get to
test.
testing here. We can do
Okay.
this. So as an aside, why not start using ECMAScript now? So Tracer, and my favorite right now is Babel. Like Babel will take and convert it into very readable ECMAScript 5 code. And so you can take our greeter service here, and again, this is how you set up a class in JavaScript. Actually, to be correct, it's a prototype. And this is what it looks like in ECMAScript 6. And under the covers, it's creating this, but it's just a lot more easier to read and easier to work with. You can see we got optional parameters here. There's a lot of other good, fun stuff in there too. All right. Controllers. So controller is a constructor function that's used to augment the scope. So every time that a view comes into place, so as you're switching between routers, we're creating a new controller each time, attaching to the scope and wiring it up. I think as of what, 1.2, they've introduced the controller as, and so you can, in here, instead of just giving the name of it, you say name of it as controller, and then you can use that as the name instead of just going directly against the scope. And this comes in really handy if you start getting into nested nested controllers within your page. You can specifically say which one I'm going after instead of having this hierarchy of controllers with stuff all over it. So before, you had to pass in a scope and put stuff on the scope. Now, the instance of the controller was what's on your scope. And so now I can, as you can see now, I can actually treat it as a real class, and then I can even use ECMAScript 6. So when you're using your scope, a couple of good rules to follow are in your template, in your HTML, that scope is read-only. You should never be assigning anything to the scope inside your HTML. And inside your controller, you should only be writing to it. Right, because you could be sitting in a hierarchy of controllers, and that scope hierarchy is sitting in there. If you're starting writing on it up here and reading it down here, that's not a good way to be. And in Angular, the model is just plain old JavaScript objects. These should be held in services, not on your scope, not in your controllers. So if we look at, again, our example from the Angular tutorial, our model here is our list of phones. Just drop right on the scope in that controller. So what happens now if I need to access that list of phones from another controller? So instead, I want to do something like this. Create a phone service, keep my list of phones there, and then to access it, the controller would act as a go-between between the service and the scope. And then you can just inject the phone service right in and off you go. And if something else needs it, a different controller needs it, just access the phone service. Now, once you start doing that, make sure you're using references instead of values. So I got an example here, user service, right? Name is a string, pass it into my controller, hook it up to an input. If I type something in there, does it change my service name? Yeah, because I'm using, right, this is just a string. I'm copying the string into that variable. So you want to do this. You want to make sure that your user is a reference to an object. Pass the reference into your controller, and now you're good to go. Okay, directives. So Angular says that directives teach HTML new tricks. And basically, directives is just a way to create a reusable component for your HTML. So one rule that I've seen pretty much everywhere is DOM manipulation should only happen in directives. Right? When I started, first time I started building Angular stuff, my controller, I started putting jQuery code in my controller. Right. Instead, those should all be sitting inside of a directive. The controller is only working as an intermediate for the data. When you name your directive, I follow lower camel case convention, and then when that's referred to in the HTML, you change the camel case to use dashes instead. And then you should always be prefixing the directive name to avoid clashes, because again, this all gets dumped into a global namespace. So if you don't have a prefix on there, it's going to be pretty easy to get collisions as you go along. There's 4 different ways you can access your directive in your HTML. I think the 2 best ones to choose from, tag name, especially if it's a component, use the tag name. If it's something that's going to decorate an existing element, you know, like an example is a lot of the ng things like ng source, stuff like that, those are all directives. Those would be attributes. Other ways you can do it with comments and class names, but this is just a lot, especially here, it's really hard to find your directive in that.
So one thing we've been doing is we use that second one there, and I just put an x-directive in front of the directive name. That way, when I'm reading it, it's easy for me to see that that attribute is really the name of my directive and not some HTML attribute.
Sure, if that makes sense. I guess I like to kind of separate them off. This being just a component in of itself. This is some visual component on my screen. This is something that is, you know, adding to an existing thing.
But to his point, if you have internal things, you know, you name a filter like, you know, color filter or something like that. A new dev walks into your shop and is like, oh, did HTML5 add a color filter? And no, that's a directive. But to his point, I think it is a reasonable, practice to have prefixing things for your own company, so that, you know, if for Virtual we did VW for a lot, VW this thing, and it's very clear that's one of ours. That's one of ours.
Yep.
Like exactly like that.
Yep. See, we're not using the prefix because we never did. But so we use the.
But still, that's something they call it.
It's the same thing to
very
call it
clearly tell it this is a directive.
Yeah.
It helps, and especially in a world where the web changes so damn fast. And yeah, you pull in libraries willy-nilly to help with stuff. You know, it's helpful to know where stuff comes from.
Good. All right, so in your directive, you can then put the template right in there in a string. In most cases, you're going to actually want to put it out into a separate file. Isolate the scope. So here's a simple example of a controller that's got a first name, last name, and a little alert function on it. And here I created a directive, put it inside a div with that controller. You can just access that stuff directly there, right? But now you're depending on somebody putting on the scope those functions, whether it's a controller or something else. So instead, it's better off to actually have separate parameters that you're passing in. The first one's an example passing in a string, so I have to interpolate it. The second one is a two-way binding. The third one is function binding. And the way this looks in the directive then is a little ampersand makes it a one-way text binding, so it's getting turned into text when it gets passed in, but then you can't change it in the directive anymore. Second option is two-way binding, so the scope variable then gets passed into the scope for the directive. And the third one is function binding, which makes whatever is in that variable a function that's being called. Pass parameters into it and such. So the only things that this thing can see from the outside scope are stuff that was passed in through here. Anything else that's in the parent scope is invisible to the directive. And then you can see that I can access these things by the name that I defined there. So one of the things that I struggled with a lot when I first started, I was trying to figure out how to, a directive is supposed to be some sort of component. How do I define an API for it? And especially, how do I make a function available? Like we had cases where we create a common modal window, and I wanted to be able to have an open function return. I did some crazy things like having the directive actually create a service on the fly that would return back that had an open function. And what I've kind of come to is a couple of different ways of doing this. One is, if I want to provide a function back, I put a slot on the controller, and I'll put in like a empty function there to make sure things don't blow up. And then also make callback functions available. And then things that I want to pass in, just input data, I'll use the string option. Callback, I'll give it a name -fn, telling it to be pretty clear that this is a function that the directive is actually going to populate that variable with a